The stone gave way before Isolde Pendleton's carriage had even finished crossing the bridge. She heard it before she saw it, a groan low and deep, like something ancient waking against its will, and then the crack of mortar, surrendering 3 centuries of silence. A great slab of the balustrade tore free and dropped into the river below, throwing up a white plume that the coachman's shout couldn't quite drown out.
Whoa, whoa there!
The carriage jolted to a halt, so hard that Isolde's traveling case slid across the seat and struck her knee. She did not cry out. She had learned long ago that crying out solved nothing, and besides, her eyes were already fixed on the gap in the stonework, measuring it the way she measured everything, instinctively, hungrily, the way another woman might measure the cut of a gown. Water damage. Old water damage, by the look of the crumbling edge. Whatever had weakened that stone had been weakening it for years. She stepped down from the carriage without waiting for the footman's hand, her boots finding the gravel with more sure-footedness than her travel-creased skirts suggested she ought to have. Calenford rose ahead of her through the thinning autumn mist, gray and vast and undeniably beautiful, the kind of house that had been built to outlast kings. And yet here she stood, not 10 yards from its gates, watching a piece of it float away down the river. "Your Grace?" The bridge. Someone was shouting from the direction of the manor, and then a man was coming toward her at something close to a run, his greatcoat unbuttoned, his dark hair disordered, as though he'd left his study at speed and hadn't paused to think of his appearance. He was younger than she'd expected. That was her first thought, foolish as it was, that a duke ought to look older, more settled, more like the portraits she'd glimpsed in London drawing rooms. This man looked as though he hadn't slept properly in a month. "Are you hurt?" He reached her, breathless, his eyes moving over her with the particular urgency of a man checking for blood. "The balustrade. I've been meaning to have it seen to. I didn't think it would. I'm quite well, Your Grace." Isolde dropped the smallest curtsy the moment allowed for. "Duke Cassian Ashford, I presume. I am Isolde Pendleton, your bride, I believe, by arrangement of the agency." Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, that she wasn't trembling, or weeping, or demanding smelling salts. He opened his mouth to say something courteous and welcoming, the sort of thing a man says to a stranger he has agreed to marry sight unseen. She didn't let him finish it. "Your Grace, forgive me, but has anyone examined the archway above your main gate?" He blinked. The gate?" Isolde was already walking toward it, her skirts gathered in one hand, her other hand reaching into the leather satchel she'd kept close through 3 days of travel. She drew out a small brass plumb line, its weighted string swinging free, and held it against the stone facing of the archway. She watched it hang. She watched, too, the faint but unmistakable lean of the stonework above it, a lean no untrained eye would have caught, but one that screamed at her the moment she'd stepped past the gate. There, she pointed to a hairline crack threading up through the mortar, disappearing into shadow. "Do you see how the plumb doesn't fall true against the wall? Your archway has shifted. Not much, perhaps 2 inches at the crown, but enough to tell me the ground beneath it is no longer bearing weight the way it once did. Miss Pendleton, there will be more of this." She turned to face him fully now, and for a moment forgot entirely that she was meant to be a demure bride arriving to meet her husband for the first time. The balustrade collapsing wasn't an accident of old age, Your Grace. Stone that old fails all at once when something beneath it gives way. Water, most likely, working through the foundations for years without anyone the wiser. If your entrance hall sits anywhere close to this archway, I would not sleep beneath its roof tonight. Cassian stared at her. Behind him, a stout older man in a steward's dark coat had come hurrying down the front steps, his expression caught somewhere between alarm and offense, but Cassian did not turn to acknowledge him. His attention had narrowed entirely onto the woman standing in his gateway, with a brass plumb line still swinging gently from her fingers. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that my house might come down around my ears within the day. Within 48 hours, I should think, if the load isn't redistributed soon." Isolde said it plainly, without drama, the way she might have remarked on the weather. "I know it isn't the greeting you expected from your bride." For a long moment, he said nothing at all. The wind moved through the bare trees along the drive, and somewhere below them, the river carried the broken stone onward, out of sight. Then, unexpectedly, something shifted in his face. Not disbelief, but something closer to desperate, cautious hope, as though a man drowning had just felt a rope brush against his hand. "Come inside, Miss Pendleton," he said quietly. "I think you had better see the rest of it." The inside of Calenford was colder than the courtyard had been. Isolde noticed it the moment she crossed the threshold. Not the ordinary chill of an autumn evening, but a deeper, damper cold that seemed to rise up through the flagstones themselves, the kind of cold that spoke of water somewhere it oughtn't be. She said nothing of it yet. She simply followed Cassian through the entrance hall, taking in the high-ribbed ceiling, the tapestries dulled with age, the enormous fireplace at the far end of the great hall, where a fire struggled against the damp and mostly lost. "Your Grace." The steward had caught up with them now, his face flushed from the walk and from something else besides. Indignation, Isolde thought, though he was doing his best to smooth it beneath a mask of correct behavior. "If I might have a word, before you go troubling yourself over a bride's fancies, Thaddeus." Cassian's voice held a warning, mild but unmistakable. "This house has stood 300 years, sir. It has weathered worse storms than any this autumn is like to bring. I hardly think a young lady fresh off the London road is in a position to— Mr. Thaddeus, is it?" Isolde turned to him with the same calm she'd shown at the gate, though something sharper moved beneath it now. "I don't doubt the house has stood 300 years. I would ask you this: has anyone descended into the cellars in the last 12-month? Thaddeus's jaw tightened. "The cellars are checked regularly for stores, madam." "I did not ask about stores." She looked past him, up at the great oak beams spanning the ceiling above the fireplace, and something in their angle caught her eye at once, a sag, subtle but present, in the third beam from the wall. "I asked whether anyone has looked at the walls themselves, the stonework, the floor." She didn't wait for his answer. She crossed the hall, skirts trailing over flagstones that were, she noted, faintly slick near the hearth, not from spilled water, but from something seeping up between the stones themselves. She crouched, pressed 2 fingers to the floor, and drew them back damp. "Your Grace, might I trouble you for a candle and a piece of scrap parchment, and perhaps some chalk, if the house has it?" Cassian sent a footman scrambling. Within minutes, Isolde had cleared a corner of the long oak table, spread a torn sheet of parchment across it, and begun sketching with quick, sure strokes, not the delicate flourishes of a lady's correspondence, but hard, functional lines, cross-hatched shading, arrows marking direction and pressure. Thaddeus watched with an expression that had curdled from indignation into something closer to bewilderment. "This beam," she said, tapping the sagging timber above the mantel without looking up from her drawing, "has borne weight it was never meant to bear, likely for years. Timber doesn't fail from age alone, Mr. Thaddeus. It fails when moisture works into it slowly, softening the fibers from within, until one day the load it's carried faithfully for decades becomes too much. I'd wager, if you took an axe to that beam's underside, you'd find rot creeping halfway through it already. That is quite a claim to make from across a room, Thaddeus said stiffly. Then let us not take it from across a room. Isolde straightened, and there was no hesitation in her now, no trace of the travel-weary bride who had stepped from the carriage an hour before. Your Grace, if you'll permit it, I should like a ladder brought, and someone willing to hold it steady. What followed astonished the household more than the collapsed balustrade had. Isolde climbed without complaint, her boots finding purchase on the rungs with the same sure-footedness she'd shown on the gravel drive, and pressed the flat of a small knife against the underside of the beam. The wood gave beneath the blade far too easily, soft, dark, weeping faintly where the steel parted it. A murmur went through the small gathering of servants who had crept in to watch. There is your rot, Mr. Thaddeus. She came down the ladder, wiping the blade clean with a scrap of linen, her voice steady, though her hands, Cassian noticed, trembled very slightly now that the climbing was done. And where there is rot in a beam this high above the floor, there is very likely water rising from somewhere far below it. The dampness in your flagstones did not come from spilled ale, Your Grace. I believe your foundations are being undermined by water, a spring perhaps, or an old drain long since forgotten and now blocked. It has been working at this house for years. The balustrade was simply the first piece to lose the fight. Cassian looked at the beam. He looked at the damp stones beneath his own boots, and then he looked at Isolde, really looked at her, as though seeing her for the first time since she'd stepped down from the carriage, and something in his exhausted face eased, just slightly, the way a man's shoulders ease when a burden he has carried alone is suddenly, unexpectedly shared. Miss Pendleton. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the hall. From this moment, you have my full authority over whatever repairs this house requires. Whatever men, whatever materials, whatever coin can be spared, they are yours to command. Your Grace, Thaddeus began, aghast. I mean it, Thaddeus. Cassian did not look away from Isolde. I have watched this house crumble around me for 2 years and buried 3 men who told me it was nothing to worry over. This is the first person who has shown me the truth of it instead of a comfortable lie. Isolde held his gaze, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind picked up against the old windows, rattling glass that had rattled the same way for 300 years. She had come to Calenford, expecting only refuge. She had not expected, in the space of a single evening, to be handed the fate of an entire estate, nor the strange, unfamiliar warmth of being believed. Morning came, gray and reluctant over Calenford, the mist still clinging to the hollows of the drive, when Cassian led Isolde down a narrow stair behind the old kitchens, a lantern held aloft in one hand. Mind the 3rd step, he warned. It's given way twice already. The air changed as they descended, the ordinary chill of the house giving way to something colder and wetter, a smell of stone and standing water that reminded Isolde of the old riverbank tunnels near her father's workshop, years before London had taken everything from her. The stair opened into a vaulted chamber, its ceiling ribbed like the inside of some great stone creature, and there, pooling across the floor in a wide, dark sheet, was water. How long has it stood like this? Isolde asked, lifting her skirts and stepping carefully along a dry ledge of stone that ran the chamber's edge. Longer than I've been, Duke, I imagine. My father called it the flooded cellar and forbade anyone from going down. I think he was ashamed of it. Cassian held the lantern higher, and the light caught the walls, pale mineral streaks running down the stone like old scars, marking where water had risen and fallen, for years beyond counting. I used to think it was simply bad luck, a house built too close to the river. It isn't luck. Isolde crouched at the water's edge, trailing her fingers through it, tasting the faint mineral coolness of a spring, rather than the muddier weight of river water. This isn't seepage from the kale. This is a spring, Your Grace, an underground one, and a strong one, by the size of this pool. Something has dammed its natural course, likely centuries ago, when the foundations were first laid, and it has been pressing against your walls ever since, looking for somewhere to go. Cassian was quiet for a moment, watching her work. Then, unexpectedly, he asked, "How does a lady come to know so much of springs and stonework, Miss Pendleton? I confess I expected accomplishments in watercolor and pianoforte, not engineering." Isolde's hand stilled in the water. She had known the question would come eventually, had rehearsed a dozen careful, evasive answers on the long carriage road north, but something about the dim lantern light, the privacy of the vault, the way he had defended her against Thaddeus without a moment's hesitation, loosened something in her chest that she hadn't meant to loosen. "I was not always meant for London drawing rooms," she said quietly. "My father was a builder, not a grand one, not titled, but a man who understood stone and water better than any architect who ever charged a fee for the privilege. He taught me, from the time I could hold a pencil steady. I could read a load-bearing wall before I could properly embroider a handkerchief, and I was glad of it. And yet, you came to Calenford by way of a marriage agency, not by way of your father's trade." Isolde rose, wiping her damp fingers on her skirt, and turned to face him fully. "Because my designs were stolen from me, Your Grace. 2 years ago, I drew a set of plans, an aqueduct system, and a buttress design meant to solve exactly the sort of trouble your house is drowning in now. I brought them to a builder in London, who promised to see them built under my father's name, since no patron would fund a woman's design outright. His name was Alistair Vance Morley." Something shifted in Cassian's expression at the name, though he said nothing yet, only watched her. "He took the plans," Isolde went on, and her voice, though steady, carried an old and bitter weight now, "built them under his own name, and told every drawing room in London that the genius was his own. My father was gone, believing I had failed him. I could not prove otherwise. I had no standing to challenge a man of Vance Morley's reputation, and no coin to fight him in the courts. So when the marriage agency offered a match far from London, with a house that needed saving, rather than a season of balls I couldn't afford, I took it, gladly." The lantern light flickered between them. For a long moment, Cassian said nothing at all, and Isolde braced herself for disbelief, or worse, for pity. But when he finally spoke, his voice was low and even. "Then it seems fate has played a strange hand, Miss Pendleton, because the very designs stolen from you may be the only thing standing between Calenford and ruin." Isolde looked at him properly then, really looked, past the exhaustion and the disordered hair and the ducal title that had frightened half of London into calling him ruthless before they'd ever exchanged a word with him, and saw instead a man who had simply been drowning, quietly, for years, with no one willing to hand him the truth. "I can adapt what I designed for the aqueduct," she said slowly, the idea taking shape even as she spoke it. "A diversion channel, cut beneath the foundations, to carry the spring's water away from the house and out toward the river, instead of letting it rise against your walls. It will take labor, it will take stone from your quarry, and timber, and men willing to trust a woman's calculations over their own instincts. But it can be done, Your Grace. I know it can." Cassian held her gaze in the lantern light, the water lapping softly at the stone ledge between them. "Then you shall have every man Calenford possesses," he said. "And you shall have my word, Miss Pendleton. Whatever debt Vance Morley owes you, I intend to see it repaid in full, one way or another. No one steals from a woman under my protection and walks away untouched." Isolde said nothing, but something tightened in her throat all the same. Gratitude, and something warmer beneath it that she did not yet have a name for, and did not yet dare to look at too closely. They rode out to Blackwood Quarry the following morning, the mist finally burned away by a pale, reluctant sun. Isolde had not ridden in some months, and she felt it in her shoulders long before Calenford's chimneys had vanished behind the tree line, but she said nothing of the ache. Cassian rode beside her at an easy pace, glancing over now and then as though still not quite certain what to make of the woman his marriage agency had sent him. "You needn't watch me for signs of falling," she said at last, when his glance had strayed toward her a third time. "I promise I shan't tumble from the saddle for want of a fainting fit." A faint smile crossed his face, the first she'd seen from him since her arrival. "Forgive me. I confess I am still adjusting to the notion of a duchess who examines timber for rot with a pocket knife. You may adjust more slowly if you like. I shan't take offense." But she found, to her own surprise, that she rather liked the smile and the ease that had crept into his voice since the vaults. Something had shifted between them in that dim, water-scarred chamber. Not courtship exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something steadier than the arrangement that had brought them together. Blackwood Quarry announced itself, long before they reached it. A great gray wound cut into the hillside, ringed with cranes and pulleys, and the ring of hammers against stone. The quarrymaster, a broad, weathered man named Higgins, greeted the Duke with the deference his title demanded, and looked considerably more doubtful when Cassian explained that it was, in fact, the lady beside him who required his stone. "Beg pardon, Your Grace, but the lady wants what exactly?" "Ashlar limestone," Isolde answered before Cassian could. "Dense-grained, quarried from your lower beds if you have them opened, nothing from the upper face. It's too porous, and I'll not have stone that drinks water like a sponge, lining a channel meant to carry it away." Higgins looked at her for a long moment, then at Cassian, as though waiting to be told the joke had run its course. When Cassian only nodded for him to answer her, the quarrymaster's expression shifted, slowly, into something more careful. "The lower beds. Aye, we've a face opened this fortnight past. Follow me, if you will." They descended together into the quarry proper, the noise of hammers and chisels rising around them, dust hanging pale in the morning light. Isolde moved among the cut stone with an ease that startled the quarrymen working nearby, running her palm flat against a block's face, tapping it lightly with a knuckle, and listening to the sound it gave back, holding pieces up toward the light to study the grain running through them. This one, she set aside a pale gray block, dense and cool beneath her hand. And this, reject anything with these thin white veins running through it. Do you see them? Gypsum. It dissolves under standing water over time, and I'll not have my channel walls weeping apart in 5 years' time because we were impatient today. You know stone the way my father knew horses, Cassian said, watching her work through the piles with quiet fascination. My father taught me to listen to it before I ever learned to listen to music. She smiled faintly, not looking up from the block in her hands. Stone doesn't lie, Your Grace. Not the way people sometimes do. It tells you exactly what it can bear, if only you trouble yourself to ask properly. They worked through the morning together, Cassian carrying stone samples back to where Isolde had chalked measurements onto a flat cutting table, holding the lantern steady when she crouched to examine the deeper cut faces, listening, genuinely listening, she noticed, not merely nodding along, as she explained why one bed of limestone would outlast another beneath running water. By midday, his hands were pale with rock dust, his fine coat abandoned somewhere on a cart, sleeves rolled to the elbow in a manner no duke of her acquaintance would ever have permitted himself in London. "You needn't trouble yourself with the labor," she told him, when he hefted a block she'd marked, without being asked. "I imagine there are men better suited to carrying stone than a duke." "There are." He set the block down beside the others, straightening with a faint grimace at his own shoulders. "But I find I would rather understand what is being built to save my house than simply be told, afterward, that it is done. My father governed this estate from a desk, Miss Pendleton, and look what it came to." Something in his voice, quiet and unguarded, caught at her more than she expected. She looked at him properly then, dust-streaked and sleeves rolled, and utterly unlike the exhausted, formal man who had come running to her carriage 2 days before, and felt the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being seen not as a curiosity, nor as a convenient solution to a crumbling house, but as someone whose knowledge, whose whole self, was worth standing beside in the dust of a quarry. "Then you shall understand every stone of it," she said, "if you're willing to carry as much as you're willing to ask." Higgins, watching from a respectful distance, exchanged a glance with one of his men, and neither of them said what both were plainly thinking, that they had never, in all their years cutting stone for Calenford, seen a duke laugh the way Cassian Ashford laughed then, dust on his hands, and a woman beside him who spoke to rock as though it might answer her back. By the time they turned their horses toward home, the cart behind them loaded with pale gray ashlar, bound for a channel not yet dug, something had settled between them that neither was quite ready to name, a partnership perhaps, or the first quiet root of something that would grow, in time, into a good deal more. The river mill sat a mile downstream from Calenford, its great wheel turning slow and steady against the current, and it was there that Isolde's calm first cracked. They had come for support beams, sound oak to frame the diversion channel before the ashlar could be laid within it, and the millmaster, a thin, nervous man named Pruitt, had shown them to a stack of timber, cut and ready, apologizing for the dust, as though dust were the greatest sin a mill could commit. Isolde ran her hand along the first beam and stopped. "Bring the lantern closer, if you please." Cassian did, and in the shifting light she traced her fingers along the underside of the wood, where a series of shallow cuts ran nearly the full length of the grain, not the rough marks of careless handling, but precise, deliberate scores, spaced with a regularity no accident could account for. "These beams have been sawn," she said quietly, "along the load-bearing edge, not cut through, no one would notice at a glance, but weakened, deliberately, so that under strain they would fail exactly where we could least afford it." Pruitt's face went the color of old parchment. "Mr. Pruitt," Cassian's voice had lost every trace of the ease it had carried in the quarry the day before. "You will tell me now who has had access to this timber." The millmaster's hands twisted together. "Your Grace, I swear to you, I never thought—" "A man came, some weeks past, from London, offering good coin for the use of the yard of an evening, said he dealt in timber speculation, wanted to inspect stock before making an offer on next season's cutting. I saw no harm in it. I never thought— His name? He never gave one plain, Your Grace. Called himself an agent, but he carried a card once. When he thought I wasn't looking, I saw the name on it. Vance Morley." Isolde went very still. "He knew," she said, half to herself, half to Cassian. "Somehow he learned I'd come to Calenford. He must have followed word of the marriage agency's arrangements, or bribed someone along the road to carry news of where I'd gone. Her voice, when she continued, had gone low and hard in a way Cassian hadn't yet heard from her. He didn't simply want to ruin your house, Your Grace. He wanted to see me fail here as thoroughly as I failed in London. He wants proof that my designs cannot be trusted, proof he can carry back to every drawing room that ever doubted his stolen plans. Cassian turned to Pruitt, and though his voice remained level, there was a coldness beneath it that made the millmaster flinch. You will give my steward a full accounting of every man who has passed through this yard in the last month, and you will consider yourself fortunate, Pruitt, that I believe a fool's greed, rather than deliberate malice, brought this about. For if I learn otherwise, you shall answer for every beam that fails beneath my roof. Yes, Your Grace. Of course, Your Grace. They left the mill with a cart of timber that could not be trusted, and a debt to a man Isolde had hoped never to think of again. On the ride back, she said little, her jaw set, her eyes fixed somewhere past the tree line, and Cassian let the silence stand for nearly a mile before he broke it. You needn't carry this alone, he said. Whatever Vance Morley intends, he intends it against Calenford now as much as against you. That makes it my fight as well as yours. It is kind of you to say so. Isolde's voice was quieter than usual, worn thin at the edges. But you did not spend 2 years watching a man take credit for your father's ruin and your own genius, while London applauded him for it. You do not know what it is to have your work called impossible in your own voice and brilliant in his. No, Cassian admitted. I don't, but I know what it is to watch a house crumble while men more concerned with their own comfort than the truth tell you it is nothing to worry over. I know what it is to feel a fool for trusting the wrong voices. He paused. I would rather trust yours. Miss Pendleton, sawn timber or no. That evening, back at Calenford, Isolde spread her measurements once more across the long oak table, working by candlelight to recalculate the channel's framework entirely. Smaller, sounder logs pulled from the estate's own modest woodland, arranged in a tighter lattice that would bear the load the sabotaged beams could no longer be trusted to carry. It was slower work, more intricate, demanding twice the joinery for half the material. But as she sketched line after careful line, she found the anger settling into something steadier and more useful, resolve. Cassian found her there past midnight. The candle burned low, and set a fresh one beside her, without a word, along with a plate of bread and cheese she had entirely forgotten to eat. You ought to sleep, he said gently. I ought, she agreed, not looking up from the parchment. But if I stop now, I shall only lie awake, thinking of everything Vance Morley might yet attempt. Better to finish the framework, while the anger still sharpens my hand, instead of clouding it. Cassian pulled out the chair across from her, and sat, saying nothing further, only watching the candlelight move across her face as she worked. And something in that quiet, unasked-for company settled the tightness in her chest more than any words of comfort could have managed. Whatever Vance Morley intended for Calenford, she thought, drawing the last line of the new lattice frame, he would find it had already been built stronger for his interference, not weaker. The storm came 2 days before anyone at Calenford expected it. Isolde felt it first in her knees, an old ache her father had once teased her about, a builder's weather sense, he'd called it, earned from years spent reading the sky before trusting a scaffold to it. By the time she mentioned it to Cassian over a hurried breakfast, the barometer in his study had already begun its slow, ominous fall, and by mid-afternoon, the sky over the western hills had turned the color of a fresh bruise. It isn't due for 2 days yet, Thaddeus insisted, standing at the drawing-room window, with his hands clasped tight behind him. The almanac clearly states, "A hairline crack split across the plaster, above the mantel, even as he spoke, fine as a thread, running from the cornice, down toward the window frame." Isolde was across the room before the dust had finished settling, pressing her palm flat against the wall to feel the faint, unmistakable tremor beneath it. "The ground is shifting," she said. "The pressure's dropping too fast, and whatever's left of the water beneath this house is rising to meet it." "We haven't finished the channel, Your Grace." "Not nearly." Cassian's face, when she turned to him, had gone pale but steady. "Then tell me what we can finish before the rain reaches us." There was no time for elegant solutions now, no time for the careful, patient joinery she'd spent the last week perfecting. Isolde spread a fresh sheet of parchment across the same table Thaddeus had once dismissed her calculations upon, and this time no one in the room doubted her hand as it moved. "An emergency sluice," she said, sketching quickly, the lines rougher now, born of urgency rather than precision. "Cut here, along the western trench we've already dug for the main channel. If we can open a temporary outflow before the storm breaks, we give the rising water somewhere to go, besides upward through your foundations. It won't hold forever, but it may hold long enough. How many men will it take? Every man this estate can spare, and every hour of daylight left to us." Cassian did not hesitate. Within the half hour, the household had transformed entirely. Footmen and grooms and kitchen boys alike gathered in the courtyard, shovels and mattocks handed out, the household's ordinary rhythms abandoned wholesale for the single, urgent purpose Isolde laid before them. She stood at the head of the trench in her plainest gown, sleeves already pinned back, and gave instructions with a clarity that left no room for argument. Where to dig, how deep, which angle would carry water fastest away from the foundations and toward the river beyond. Not every man trusted her at first. She saw it in the sideways glances, the murmured doubts among the older laborers who had served Calenford since before Cassian's father held the title, a woman, and a stranger besides, directing men who'd broken ground on this land their whole lives. But Cassian walked the length of the trench himself, sleeves rolled, mud already climbing his boots, and worked alongside them without a word of complaint, and slowly, watching their duke labor shoulder to shoulder with the woman he'd married a week before, the doubt among the men began to thin. "Trust her hands," Cassian said once, to no one in particular, loud enough to carry down the trench. "They've not been wrong yet." Thaddeus remained by the manor steps through most of the afternoon, arms folded, his disapproval carved plainly into his face. But even he, Isolde noticed, said nothing more to countermand her instructions. And once, when a young groom hesitated over where to set a support beam, it was Thaddeus himself who pointed, gruffly, toward the mark she had chalked upon the ground. By the time the first heavy drops began to fall, the western trench had been cut deep enough to matter, its edges shored with the timber lattice Isolde had built to replace what Vance Morley's sabotage had ruined. She stood at its edge as the rain thickened around her, hair coming loose from its pins, watching the sky darken from bruised purple to something closer to black, and felt, for the first time since her arrival at Calenford, the particular exhaustion of having given everything she had toward something that mattered. Cassian came to stand beside her, his coat soaked through, mud streaked along one cheek where he'd wiped away the rain with a filthy hand. "Will it be enough?" he asked quietly. The question meant only for her. Isolde watched the water already beginning to find its way along the channel they'd cut, obedient to the path she'd laid for it, rather than the ruin it had intended for the house above. "I don't know," she admitted, and found, strangely, that admitting it to him cost her nothing at all. "But it's the truest thing I know how to build, Your Grace. If it fails, It won't be for want of trying honestly." He looked at her for a long moment through the rain, and something in his expression, worry and admiration, and something warmer still that neither of them had yet found words for, settled over her more steadily than any promise could have. "Then it will be enough," he said, "because I don't believe you know how to fail honestly and call it defeat." Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the western hills, closer now, and the household began hurrying indoors as the rain turned from a warning into a downpour in earnest. But Isolde lingered one moment longer at the trench's edge, watching her makeshift sluice hold steady against the rising water, and allowed herself, just briefly, to hope that Calenford might yet survive the night. The storm had not yet broken in full when the carriage arrived. Isolde heard it before she saw it, wheels grinding against wet gravel, too fine and too fast for a tenant's cart, and something in the sound made her set down the length of rope she'd been coiling and go still. She was still in her mud-streaked gown, her hair loose and damp against her neck, when the front doors opened and a footman announced, with visible unease, that a Mr. Alistair Vance Morley had come to call upon His Grace. Cassian's face, when Isolde glanced at him across the entrance hall, hardened into something she hadn't seen from him before. "Show him to the parlor," he said, "and send word to Miss Pendleton's chamber that she needn't trouble herself to appear." "I'll trouble myself gladly," Isolde said, before the footman had taken 2 steps. "I've no intention of hiding from him, Your Grace. Let him see exactly what his sabotage failed to accomplish." The grand parlor, when they entered it together, already held the man Isolde had spent 2 years trying not to picture. He was elegant in a way London had always rewarded, coat cut with careless expense, cravat pinned with a jewel too fine for a country call, and he rose from the settee with a smile that faltered, just slightly, the moment his eyes found her standing beside the Duke. "Miss Pendleton." His voice recovered its polish quickly, though not quickly enough to hide the flicker of alarm beneath it. "I confess, I had not expected—" "You had not expected to find me at all," she said evenly. "I imagine you thought your man at the mill had seen to that." A muscle tightened along his jaw, but he turned smoothly to Cassian instead, as though she hadn't spoken. "Your Grace, I've come with an offer, and I hope you'll hear it in the spirit it's meant. Word has reached London of Calenford's troubles, the collapsed balustrade, the flooding, the debts, I understand, have been mounting for some seasons now. I'm prepared to offer a fair price for the estate, structures, and land both, and spare you the burden of watching it fall to ruin around you." "How generous," Cassian said, in a tone that suggested he found it nothing of the kind. "And how convenient that you should arrive so promptly to make the offer, given that the trouble you describe has only worsened this week, and worsened, I believe, at the hand of an agent you sent to sabotage my timber." Vance Morley's smile thinned, but held. "I've no notion what you mean, Your Grace." "I deal in property, not in petty mischief." "Then perhaps," Isolde said, stepping forward before Cassian could answer, "you'd care to discuss the aqueduct system you built along the Thames 3 years past, the one that made your name in every drawing room from Mayfair to Kensington." Something in his composure cracked, just barely, at the mention of it. "A fine piece of engineering," she continued, walking slowly toward the small writing desk near the window, where she'd left a folded sheet of parchment earlier that morning, half suspecting she might have use for it. "Praised in 3 separate journals, if I recall. I read each account with great interest, Mr. Vance Morley, because I recognized every measurement in it, my measurements, my father's calculations, refined by my own hand, stolen from the plans I brought to your office 2 years ago. A serious accusation," he said, though his voice had lost its easy polish now, "and one you cannot prove." Can't I? Isolde unfolded the parchment and laid it flat upon the table between them. Not the original stolen plans, which she no longer possessed, but a fresh set of calculations she'd reconstructed from memory the week before, anticipating exactly this moment. Your aqueduct's load-bearing arches are miscalculated by a margin that any competent engineer would catch within the hour, a flaw I corrected in my original design before it was taken from me, and one you clearly never understood well enough to correct yourself. Tell me, Mr. Vance Morley, has your Thames aqueduct shown any signs of strain this past year? Any cracking along the third and fourth arches, perhaps, where the load distributes unevenly? The silence that followed told her everything she needed to know. There have been some minor repairs, he admitted stiffly. Nothing of consequence. There will be more, Isolde said, and they will worsen, because the flaw was never fixed. It was only hidden beneath a great deal of praise you didn't earn. I built that aqueduct on paper, Mr. Vance Morley, corrected its every weakness, and you built it in stone without understanding a single principle behind my corrections. It is only a matter of time before London learns exactly whose genius that structure owes its survival to, and whose ignorance threatens to bring it down. Cassian, who had watched this unfold in silence, finally stepped forward, his voice quiet but final. You have your answer, Mr. Vance Morley. Calenford is not for sale, not to a man who sabotages timber under cover of darkness, and certainly not to a man who has built his entire reputation upon a woman's stolen work. I would advise you to leave before I decide your visit warrants a magistrate's attention rather than merely a closed door. Vance Morley's composure had entirely abandoned him now, his gaze moving between them with something close to fear. He gathered his hat, offered no further pleasantries, and left the parlor with considerably less grace than he'd entered it, the front doors closing hard behind him against the rising wind. For a long moment after his carriage wheels had faded back down the drive, neither Isolde nor Cassian spoke. Then he turned to her, something fierce and admiring in his expression that she hadn't seen from him before. "Remind me," he said softly, "never to underestimate what you keep folded in your writing desk." Isolde, despite the exhaustion of the day and the storm still gathering beyond the windows, found herself laughing, a real laugh, unguarded, the first she'd allowed herself since arriving at Calenford. "I've learned, Your Grace," she said, "that a woman who wishes to be believed had better carry her proof with her, always." By nightfall, the storm had stopped threatening and begun, in earnest, to arrive. Rain fell in heavy, slanting sheets across the western hillside, and the wind carried it sideways into the lantern light, where Isolde and Cassian worked alongside a dozen laborers, deepening the culvert trenches that had, until that afternoon, seemed sturdy enough to see them through the night. The ground told a different story now. Water was rising faster than the temporary sluice could carry it away, pooling in low patches along the trench floor, and every hour brought the manor's foundations closer to the danger Isolde had first warned of, at the crumbling gate. "We need the western outflow widened," she called over the rain, crouched at the trench's edge with a lantern held low against the wind. "If it narrows any further, the whole channel will back up and send the water straight for the house, instead of away from it." Cassian was already knee-deep in mud beside two of the estate's grooms, hauling a length of timber shoring into place. He hadn't stopped moving since the light had begun to fail. Coat long since abandoned, shirt soaked through and clinging to him, hands raw from rope and stone. He looked up at her words and nodded once, wiping rain from his eyes with the back of a filthy hand. "You heard her," he called down the line. "Widen the outflow. North side first." The men worked with a grim, determined haste now. no longer doubting her instructions the way they had at the start of the week. Isolde moved along the trench herself, checking the angle of each new cut against the calculations she carried, half memorized, in her head, adjusting here, correcting there, her voice hoarse, from shouting over wind and rain both. It was the mudslide that nearly undid them. A section of the hillside above the main trench gave way without warning. A heavy, sliding mass of sodden earth, crashing down and burying the outflow channel entirely, choking the water's only path away from the house. Isolde heard the shout go up before she fully understood what had happened, and by the time she reached the blockage, Cassian was already there, driving a shovel into the mud with a strength born of pure desperation. "It's backing up already!" one of the grooms shouted, pointing to where the trench water had begun pooling dangerously close to the manor's western wall. "Another quarter hour, and it'll find the foundations again. Then we haven't a quarter hour to lose." Isolde dropped to her knees beside the blocked outflow, ignoring the mud soaking through her skirts entirely, and began clawing debris away with her bare hands alongside Cassian's shovel. "The shoring, Your Grace. If the timber gives way while we're digging, this whole section could collapse in on us. Then we work fast, and we work careful," Cassian said, through gritted teeth. Both at once. They dug together in the lantern light, rain hammering down around them, the mud slick and heavy and unforgiving. Isolde directed two of the grooms to brace the loosened timber shoring, while she and Cassian cleared the blockage itself, her hands growing numb with cold, her arms trembling with an exhaustion she refused to acknowledge. Once, the shoring groaned and shifted dangerously, and Cassian threw himself against it bodily, bracing the timber with his own weight until the groom beside him could drive a fresh support into place. "Cassian!" It was the first time she had used his given name, torn from her without thought, in the panic of the moment, and neither of them seemed to notice the significance of it until much later. "Mind the beam. If it shifts again, I have it." His voice was strained but steady, his shoulder set hard against the timber, rain streaming down his face. "Finish clearing the channel. I'll hold." She worked faster then, driven by something sharper than duty, a fear, sudden and consuming, that she might lose him beneath a collapsing trench wall before either of them had properly understood what had begun growing between them. When the last of the blockage finally gave way, water rushed forward through the cleared channel with a sound like relief itself, pouring past the manor's foundations and away toward the river beyond, exactly as she had designed it to. Cassian released the timber slowly, testing it, and when it held firm beneath the rushing water, something in his exhausted face broke open into an expression Isolde had not seen from him before. Pure, unguarded relief, edged with something warmer still. "It's holding," he said, half to himself, staring at the water rushing safely past. "Isolde, it's holding." It was the first time he had used her given name as well, and the sound of it in his rain-roughened voice settled something deep in her chest that she had spent 2 years guarding fiercely against anyone's reach. They sat together afterward on the trench's muddy edge, too spent to move further, the rain finally beginning to ease into something gentler as the worst of the storm passed overhead and on toward the coast. Cassian's shoulder rested against hers, neither of them troubling to maintain the careful distance propriety usually demanded, and for a long moment they simply watched the water flow past in the lantern light, safe now, obedient to the design she had built with her own 2 hands. "You could have stayed in the house tonight," Cassian said quietly, "safe and dry, and let the laborers manage the digging." "So could you," Isolde said, "safe in your study. the way your father managed this estate from a desk. I told you once, I'd rather understand what was being built than simply be told, afterward, that it was done." He turned his head to look at her, rain still dripping from his dark hair, and something unguarded passed between them in the lantern light. "I find I feel the same, now, about you. I'd rather stand beside you in the mud than watch from a window while you save my house alone." Isolde said nothing for a long moment, only let the warmth of his shoulder against hers speak in place of words neither of them was yet brave enough to say outright. But something had shifted between them in the earthworks that night, something neither mud nor exhaustion nor 2 years of careful guarding could undo. By the small hours of the morning, the rain had gentled to a steady patter, but the danger beneath Calenford had not passed with it. Isolde knew it the moment she woke, roused not by any sound but by the same builder's instinct that had warned her of the storm 2 days before. A wrongness felt through the soles of her feet, even through the floorboards. She dressed quickly, without calling for help, and made her way down through the sleeping house toward the cellar stair, lantern in hand, her heart already quickening with a dread she couldn't quite name. She found Cassian already there, standing at the top of the vault stairs in his shirt sleeves, a lantern of his own casting long shadows across the damp stone. "You felt it too," he said, and it wasn't a question. "The pressure's built all night behind the temporary sluice. If it hasn't reached its limit already, it will before dawn." Isolde was already moving past him, down into the dark, the sound of rushing water growing louder with every step. "The permanent channel isn't finished, Your Grace. We've only the emergency work to hold it, and emergency work was never meant to bear a full night of storm water." The vault, when they reached it, told her everything she'd feared. The spring's water had risen far higher than it had stood 2 days before, pressing hard and dark against the chamber's stone walls, the sound of it no longer a gentle trickle, but a low, threatening roar that echoed strangely off the vaulted ceiling. The wooden locking gear of her makeshift sluice sat half submerged now, straining visibly against the pressure building behind it. "If that gate fails on its own," Isolde said, wading forward through water that had already climbed past her ankles, her voice tight with urgency, "it'll fail all at once, and the surge will tear straight through the outflow channel we dug last night, and likely through the foundation wall beside it. I have to trip it manually, control the release before the water controls it for us." "Isolde, the current? There's no time to argue it." She was already moving toward the locking mechanism, her skirts heavy and dragging in the rising water, the lantern light throwing wild shadows as the chamber's roar grew louder around them. "If I don't release it now, in a controlled measure, we lose the manor tonight, after everything we've built to save it." Cassian didn't argue further. He simply followed her into the water, his hand finding the small of her back to steady her against the current's pull, and together they reached the sluice gate's locking gear, a heavy iron pin set through worn wood, slick now with damp and strain. "On my word," Isolde said, bracing herself against the stone wall beside the mechanism. "We ease it, not force it. If we release the pressure all at once, the surge could take the channel walls with it. Tell me when." She watched the water's dark surface, reading its restless movement the way another woman might read a face, judging the exact moment the pressure had built high enough to release safely, without catastrophe. Her hands, numb with cold, closed around the iron pin. Now, they worked the mechanism together, Cassian's strength lending force to her precise, careful control, and the locking gear gave way with a groan of tortured wood. Water surged forward through the opening gate, not the uncontrolled violence Isolde had feared, but a strong, steady rush that found the channel she had built for it and followed the path exactly as her calculations had promised, carrying the spring's fury away from the foundations and out toward the distant river beyond. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them moved, watching the water level in the vault begin, unmistakably, to fall. "It's working," Cassian said, his voice hoarse with disbelief and something closer to wonder. "Isolde, look, it's actually working." She watched the dark water recede from the stone walls inch by inch. The pressure that had threatened to tear Caelenford's foundations apart, draining harmlessly away into the channel she'd designed with her own hands, using knowledge that London had once called impossible for a woman to possess. Something in her chest loosened that had been tight for 2 long years. Not merely relief that the manor would stand, but something deeper, quieter. The particular vindication of watching her own genius prove itself true where a thief's stolen version never could. "We did it," she said softly, and found her voice unsteady in a way the danger itself had never made it. "Cassian, we actually did it." He turned to her in the dim lantern light, water still receding around their soaked boots, and reached out to brush a strand of wet hair from her face with a gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with the exhausted, mud-streaked night behind them. "You did it," he said quietly. "I only had the good sense to trust you when it mattered. You had rather more than good sense, Your Grace." Isolde found herself smiling despite the cold, despite the exhaustion aching through every limb. "You had the courage to hand a stranger your entire house on nothing more than her word, and never once asked me to prove myself twice." "I didn't need to ask twice." His hand lingered near her face, a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, and neither of them moved to correct it. "You proved it, the moment you stepped down from that carriage with a plumb line in your hand instead of a fan." The water continued its slow retreat around them, the vault's dangerous roar softening into something almost peaceful, and in the lantern's warm light, standing soaked and exhausted amid the very foundations they had saved together, Isolde allowed herself, for the first time since London had taken everything from her, to believe that she had finally found a place, and a person, worth trusting completely. 2 days after the storm passed, a fine black carriage bearing the crest of the Crown Office made its way up Caelenford's Drive, and the entire household turned out to watch it come with something close to dread. "He'll have come to appraise the land for seizure," Thaddeus said grimly, standing beside Cassian at the top of the front steps. "Word of the estate's debts and its troubles has clearly reached London faster than we'd hoped. The Crown doesn't send surveyors out of idle curiosity, Your Grace." Isolde, standing on Cassian's other side in her plainest morning gown, felt her stomach tighten all the same, despite the steadiness she'd worked hard to maintain since the vault had drained safely 2 nights before. A seizure now, after everything they'd built, would undo not merely the estate's fortunes, but the fragile, hard-won trust that had grown between the household and its unlikely duchess. The surveyor who stepped down from the carriage was an older man, silver-haired and precise in his movements, a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm, and an expression that suggested he had come prepared to find exactly the ruin rumor had promised him. "Mr. Halloway, Crown Surveyor's Office," he said, with a bow correct enough to satisfy protocol, and no warmer than it needed to be. "I've come at the request of the Exchequer to assess Caelenford's holdings, given certain reports of the estate's declining condition." "Certain reports," Cassian repeated evenly, "that I suspect owe more to a disappointed London builder's spite than to any honest account of this house." Halloway's expression didn't change. "Be that as it may, Your Grace, my findings will be my own, and I'll thank you to let me make them without prejudice on either side." He began his inspection at once, moving through the grounds with a surveyor's methodical thoroughness, checking the courtyard where the collapsed balustrade had once threatened the entrance, now rebuilt with the dense gray ashlar Isolde had chosen at Blackwood Quarry, examining the great gate archway, its lean corrected, its stonework sound, making careful notes as he went that revealed nothing of his conclusions. It was the western hillside that seemed to catch his attention most. He stood a long while at the edge of the permanent channel, now nearly finished, its stone-lined walls carrying a steady, controlled flow of spring water away from the manor and toward the river beyond, exactly as it had been designed to do. "This is recent work," he said, crouching to examine the stonework more closely. "Recent, and considerably more sophisticated than I'd expect from an estate in the condition your reports described." "It is, Mr. Halloway." Isolde stepped forward before Cassian could answer, unwilling to let credit for the design slip past unclaimed a second time in her life. "I designed and oversaw its construction myself, along with the drainage sluice that saved the manor's foundations during the storm 2 nights past." Halloway looked up at her with an expression she recognized immediately, the same faint, polite disbelief she'd met in every London office that had ever turned her away. "You designed this, Miss Duchess Ashford," she corrected, quietly but firmly. "And yes, Mr. Halloway, every measurement, every stone selection, every calculation of load and pressure. I should be glad to show you the full plans, if you doubt it." He did doubt it. She could see it plainly in his face. But he followed her nonetheless, first down into the vaults, where the water level had settled permanently below the danger line it had once threatened, then along the length of the channel itself, where she walked him through each calculation with the same precise, patient clarity she'd once used to convince a roomful of skeptical laborers to trust her hands. She showed him the diverted spring, the reinforced foundation walls, the careful drainage that had turned Calenford's greatest weakness into a system more advanced than anything London's celebrated builders had yet achieved. By the time they returned to the courtyard, something in Halloway's manner had shifted considerably. "Duchess Ashford," he said slowly, consulting the notes he'd made throughout the morning. "I confess, I arrived here expecting to document a ruin fit only for the Crown's disposal. I find instead an estate more soundly engineered than half the properties I've surveyed in a decade of service." He paused, studying her with new and genuine interest. "This drainage design, I've seen nothing like it, save perhaps certain principles employed in a Thames aqueduct project some years back, though considerably improved upon here. The Thames aqueduct," Isolde said evenly, "was built upon designs stolen from me 2 years ago, Mr. Halloway, by a man who never understood the calculations well enough to correct their flaws. What you see here is the design as it was always meant to function, corrected, complete, and built under my own name for the first time." Halloway's pen paused above his portfolio. For a long moment, he said nothing, weighing something Isolde couldn't quite read in his expression, and then, slowly, he began to write. "I shall document this appropriately in my report," he said at last, "and I shall document it accurately, Duchess Ashford, as your work, credited to your own name, with a formal notation regarding the irregularities surrounding the Thames project as well. The Crown Office does not look kindly upon stolen credit, once it's brought properly to light." He closed his portfolio with a decisive snap. "As for Calenford's standing, I see no grounds whatsoever for seizure, Your Grace. Quite the opposite. I intend to recommend this estate as a model of sound engineering to be studied, not surrendered." Cassian's hand found Isolde's, unashamed of the surveyor's watching eyes, and squeezed it once, firmly. "Thank you, Mr. Halloway," he said, "though I confess, the credit belongs entirely to my wife." Isolde watched the surveyor's carriage depart down the drive an hour later, the formal report already sealed within his portfolio, and felt something settle inside her that 2 years of stolen credit and quiet grief had never allowed to rest. For the first time since Vance Morley had taken her name from beneath her own work, it had been given back to her, not by favor, not by pity, but by the plain, undeniable truth of stone and water and calculations that could not lie. 3 days after the surveyor's carriage had disappeared down the drive, Cassian led Isolde up a narrow spiral stair she had not yet had occasion to climb, into a tower room she hadn't known the manor possessed. "Your Grace, if this is another crisis requiring my immediate attention," she said, only half in jest, still slightly breathless from the stairs, "I confess, I had hoped for at least a full week of peace before the next one. No crisis." Cassian pushed open the door at the top of the stair and stepped aside to let her enter first. Only a gift long overdue. The room beyond took her breath away, for reasons that had nothing to do with the climb. It was a drafting studio, unmistakably so, built and fitted with a purpose she recognized at a glance. Tall windows lined 3 walls, angled to catch the last golden light of the valley beyond, exactly the sort of northern exposure her father had always insisted was kindest to a draftsman's eye. A long table stood at the room's center, sturdy oak, its surface bare and waiting. Shelves lined the remaining wall, empty still, but built with precisely the right depth for rolled plans and surveying instruments. "Cassian," her voice caught on his name, unfamiliar warmth rising in her throat. "What is all this?" "Yours." He crossed to the long table, resting his hand upon its bare surface. "I had the household carpenters begin work on it the morning after we tested the sluice, though I confess I swore them all to secrecy, wanting it to be a surprise rather than another burden for you to oversee." He glanced at her, something almost uncertain in his expression, despite the confidence he'd shown her in every crisis since her arrival. "You saved this house with nothing but a satchel of instruments and the knowledge you carried in your own head. I thought it long past time you had a proper place to put both to use. Not out of necessity, Isolde. Not because the roof threatens to fall without you. Simply because your work deserves a home of its own." Isolde moved slowly around the room, trailing her fingers along the empty shelves, the angled windows, the sturdy table built for exactly the kind of careful, exacting work she had spent 2 years believing no one would ever value openly again. When she turned back to him, her eyes were bright with something she hadn't expected to feel. Not the grim satisfaction of vindication she'd carried since the surveyor's visit, but something softer, something that ached in an entirely different way. "No one has ever built anything for me before," she said quietly. "Only ever taken what I built for themselves. Then let this be the first of many things built for you, rather than taken from you." Cassian reached into his coat and drew out a single clean sheet of vellum, unrolling it carefully upon the waiting table. "I've brought you nothing to correct today. No collapsing gate, no flooded vault, no stolen design to reclaim. Only a blank page, Isolde, and whatever you might choose to draw upon it." She looked down at the empty vellum, its surface pale and waiting in the evening light, and felt the full weight of what he was truly offering her settle slowly into place. "What would you have me design, Your Grace?" "Whatever you like." He came to stand beside her at the table, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even without touching. A conservatory for the south wall, perhaps, if you've a mind for something less urgent than saving foundations, or new stables, or a proper library wing, or nothing at all beyond whatever occupies your mind on a quiet afternoon. I find I no longer care what you draw, Isolde, so long as I'm permitted to watch you draw it. She set her hand upon the vellum's edge and found it trembling slightly, not from exhaustion this time, nor from fear, but from something she hadn't allowed herself to feel fully since the marriage agency's arrangement had first sent her north. I came to Calenford believing I had nothing left to offer beyond a stranger's convenient bride, she said softly. A woman fleeing ruin, grateful simply to have somewhere to go. I never imagined. Her voice caught, and she looked up at him properly, the last of the guarded distance she'd carried since London, finally, quietly, falling away. I never imagined I might find someone who would value the very thing that ruined me everywhere else, who would call it a gift instead of a curiosity to be tolerated. It was never simply tolerated, Isolde. Cassian's hand found hers where it rested against the table's edge, and this time neither of them pretended propriety required otherwise. I watched you save this house with nothing but knowledge and courage, and I confess I fell in love with you somewhere between the crumbling gate and the flooded vault, though I hadn't the sense to say so until now. Not out of gratitude. Not because you saved Calenford, though God knows you did. Simply because I have never known anyone who faced the world so plainly, so honestly, and I find I cannot imagine facing the rest of my own life without you beside me. The last of the evening light caught the empty vellum between them, gold spilling across its untouched surface, and Isolde felt something settle in her chest that 2 years of stolen credit and quiet grief had never once allowed her to feel. Not merely safety, though there was that, but a future, genuinely, entirely her own to design. Then perhaps, she said, her voice steady now, warm with something that had been waiting a long while to be spoken aloud, I ought to draw us both a life worth building, Your Grace, slowly and properly and without a single crisis to rush it. I should like that very much, Cassian said, and drew her hand to his lips. Though I confess, Duchess Ashford, I have found I rather enjoy watching you work under pressure. You've a gift for making even ruin look like the beginning of something remarkable. Isolde laughed then, unguarded and full, and picked up the pen he'd left waiting beside the vellum. Outside the tower windows the valley stretched golden and whole beneath the settling evening light. Calenford's foundations sound at last beneath it. And inside, in a sunlit room built entirely for her, she began, at last, to draw a blueprint for a life no one could ever again take from her.